Hey guys, I'm Flipfire Hunter, and this is my video on really just my opinion on trading points and like how to best utilize them. I know there's been like a billion of these videos. I know quite a lot of my friends have done these videos, so yeah, I've seen people do this. I've seen people I call friends do this video. So yeah, basically this is just my video on it. I wouldn't say it's my interpretation. I'll be doing like a bit of a first. I'll start with a rundown on trading points, and then I'm gonna look over, just basically have a look at training points in general, like where I would recommend spending them. Now, the way I would recommend them is I would actually say with training points, I'm going to be dividing it into three areas. So early game, mid game, and late game. Early game is going to be up to level 50. So basically up to Dragonspire is when you're, to pass Dragonspire would be mid game. So that's like Celestia, and I think on to Chrysalis. And then for Chrysalis onwards, I'm going to class that as late game. And even in them, I'm going to categorize each of these into three tiers. So, and these are going to be, so with these tiers, I'm going to say like the tier 1 are stuff I would say you need to get no matter what. It doesn't matter if you're, it doesn't matter if you're life, doesn't matter if you're fire, doesn't matter if you're myth, doesn't matter if you're balance. It doesn't matter. You get these. Basically, get these spells no matter what. Tier 2s are maybe, you can get them. And tier 3s are stuff which, if you've got the points, get them. And if you don't have the points, if you don't have the points, just, it doesn't really matter. If you have the points and you can get them, then, yeah, grab them. So, before I start, I'm just going to give a quick, brief rundown on training points and what they are. So, training points are a currency in this game. You can see I've got 20 of them. You get one for every 4 level ups up to level 20. So like when you're level 4, level 8, level 12, level 16, level 20, you'll get a trading point. After level 20 onwards, you get them every 5 points, so level 25, etc., all the way up to 160. So you get trading points for leveling up. There's also quests throughout the game, such as the Zeke quest, some of the Eloise quests give them. And there's a few training point quests throughout the game, scattered throughout. Most of them are just, go to specific areas and grab just grab stuff from specific areas. I think there's one in like Avalon, there's one in Chrysalis. Or they can be quite easy, like there's one in in Celestia, which gives you 3, but it's just like make a sandwich or something like that. It's, those are pretty, those ones are pretty easy, which if you see a training point quest, do it. Because training point quests, especially in the early game, are very important. The Zeke quests are probably the most well-known ones, so yeah, that's how you get them. And the way they're used, for the two people who don't understand, or just don't know yet, basically they're used to train for spells outside your specific school. So for example, if you see a fire spell in your fire, you can train it without any hassle, basically. So, like, if you see Tranquilize from Mortis, I believe it is, you can train it without issue. But for something like Tower Shield, for example, which you get from Ice, you really... Yeah, Ice School, you can train it from the Ice School over here. If you're Ice, you get it for free, but if you're Fire, you have to spend a training point for it. So, with that being said, I'm just going to cover over some do's and don'ts for training points. The first, it's really just these are the don'ts. The first thing you should never do is just do not just go willy-nilly. Don't go in Storm and buy like a serpent, for example. Then go to Ice and buy the Frost Beetle, then go like that. That is stupid and you're wasting training points. And by the time you've gotten around all of the schools to do that, it would have been like, level 24, something like that, level 20. And your main school, you'd have 4 pip spells by that point. So, it'll be a waste. The second thing, which this is a noob trap in a way. It doesn't hurt in the late game as much when your training points are abundant. But in the early game, it will hurt a lot. Is specialising in a specific school. Now, if you don't know, most people will usually just go to Storm and will be like, I want some high damaging Storm spells. I'm just going to pick up this flower. It'll go, I need some high damaging Storm spells, so they'll go into Storm. And that's a problem in the early game because you'll be wasting points that you could be spending elsewhere on stuff that are quite useful, like, for example, ice spells, for tower shield, or death spells for feint. And that's really what it is with training points. And basically, that's what I'm going to be saying. You'll see what I mean when I talk about these. But I'm going to, I would recommend with training points is to go up to the specific spell that you want to get and you need to get. So, for example, if now obviously some schools will need this more than others. For example, a fire doesn't really typically need a tower shield. They're nice to have, but someone like, say, Death is going to have a lot more use of tower shield because Death's got a lot more training points and they're a lot more abundant with training points. The same with Life. And again, a Death probably won't need to train to the Life School because they're drains, but someone like a solo Myth, for example, might see more benefit into the Life School over some other schools. That being said, I'm going to be starting with the early world. And again, like I said, tier 1s are going to be stuff which are basically essential. Like, you have to get these no matter what. Tier 2s, for some schools they will be essential, but for others, not so much. And tier 3s, yeah, you can get them if you have the points, but for the most part, it's not going to be worth grabbing them. So yeah, we'll start with what I think are the tier 1 spells and then work my way down. Now, I'm pretty sure this is the most unsurprising one on the list. If you know anything about this game, you'll know why I'm in the Death School. And the first thing you want to grab is a spell that I've already grabbed actually, but I mean, I've already grabbed these spells, so you have to train them up, obviously, normally. But the first thing you want to grab is Feint. Feint is, I believe, the 6th or 7th death spell. I can't remember. But you have to. It's a bit of a climb up the death tree, but you should grab this. The main reason, look at that, a plus 70 for the next hitting spell, regardless of school. It is by far probably the most important trap in the game. Now, some bosses do work their ways around feints. For example, there are some bosses that will get rid of them instantly. Some bosses will just use like a sacrifice on themselves when they get feinted. Other bosses will literally flip the feint around so that you get the 70 and they get the 30. But yeah, feint is a very, very, very important spell in the early game. And I would recommend the first thing you should always do is going straight down death and grabbing feint. You also get stuff like Ghoul and Vampire along the route, which, I mean, Ghoul's probably the best 2-pip spell in the game because they heal back. But yeah, Ghoul, you'll get Ghoul and Vampire and stuff like that. So it's a really good spell to grab, and in my opinion, yeah, it's a tier 1 and it's the easiest. It's probably the first thing you should grab. Now let's talk about the other tier 1, and there's only really another tier 1 that you should grab, and that is talking to this tree here, Niles. Now, Niles gives access to the Elemental and Spirit Blade and Trap spells. The ones I'm looking at for now is Spirit Blade and Elemental Blade. Depending on what school you are, so if you're Fire, Ice or Storm, grab Elemental Blade. If you're if you're Life, Death or Myth, grab Spirit Blade. And the reason you want to be grabbing these spells is because, well, they are a 35 blade that stacks with every other blade. So if you're using a Fire Blade, and you can then use an Elemental Blade, and you'll get basically 2 blades. Now, they do lose their effect in the mid and late game, but especially in the late game when you're going to be hitting quickly with like Dragon and Meteor Strike, it's much better to just use Fire Blades or your Skull Blades. But that being said, they are still very good, especially in the early game. The early game usage for them is pretty much paramount, which is why they're coming in as a top tier pick. You're going to be using these quite a lot. I think the world I stopped using them personally was I think it was around Azteca I stopped using it because I got Sharpen, which I'll talk about later. But yeah, other than that, they're still very good. And even with Sharpen, you can still get, like, they're really good if you're supporting class, a supporting school like Ice, like Life, like Myth, like, well, Death really. Any Spirit schools in general. But yeah, if you're playing as a supporting school like Ice, then Elemental Blade is very useful. Anyway, that's the end of the tier 1s actually, because those are the only tier 1s you can get. So tier 2s, after you've got these tier 1 spells, it's probably now best to go into the tier 2 ones. So yeah, we'll start with what now again, tier 2s, these are going to be in no particular order. I'm just going to be doing them based on, where I find them, really, when I can get to them. Well, I don't need to go far for the first tier 2. It's Gnarls again, and it's actually Spirit and Elemental Trap for the exact same reason as Spirit and Elemental Blade. It's just really good. Now, again, it's really good for specific schools that focus on hitting, so not hitting on support. So schools like, for example, Ice, Ice, Life and Death are going to be making more use of these than a school like, say, Storm. But even schools like... But Fire probably gets the best use of it, and that is because of their Scion here. 6 traps is quite easy to get for Fire anyways, because of stuff like, for example, Fuel, Backdraft, Fire Trap, and Elemental Trap pretty much helps in this regard. It's not as good as, say, for example, using Fuel, but it's still a solid 30 trap. And also, you don't have to worry about, you have Ice and Storm traps as well. So you don't have to really worry too much about this, them being knocked out by something random, by random bullshit. So it's good. And they're okay, and they're good for if you're on support, but if you're on your own, maybe not the best. So that's why they're coming in on tier 2, rather than Elemental Blade and Spirit Blades. The Blades that are coming in as tier 1. Also as well, unlike the Blades, which, you can use them on AoEs, you can't really use the traps as AoEs, unless you're specifically targeting one boss. In which case, yeah, it's best to just go for, it's better to go for a Blade, Elemental Blade and Elemental Trap, or Spirit Blade and Spirit Trap. This one is actually really debatable for a tier 2, and the reason it's not on tier 1 is because of how debatable it is, and for some schools, yeah, you're not going to be using this as much, but that's Life. And the reason I'm saying Life is debatable at tier 2 is because, well, you don't really get much from it, basically. And the problem is with Life, which is why I'm not saying it's a tier 2, is because Death doesn't need it at all. Okay, you can go the entire game with Death as a Death, and you won't need to train into Life. And also, if you're playing with a friend who is either a Life or a Balance, again, you won't really need it too much because they'll be doing the healing. So, let's say you're a Storm, and you're doing a co-op or a duo. You've got a Life on your team, you've got a Balance on your team. You won't need to go into Life too much, which is why it's on tier 2, in my opinion. And you do get Pixie as well. Regardless, you will get Pixie. So you will get some life healing spell. But I think the main thing is, if you're solo questing, like I often do, Seder is a really good spell to grab. Because, well, it's Seder. You get a lot of heal from it. It's a pretty good heal for 4 pips. And again, you really only need you need a life mastery as well, or an exalted one. I think I've got one of these, and I don't. It might be it's probably in like some junk chest somewhere, but if you've got a life mastery or like an exalted or a, what are they called, the Lutherlum ones, any of the mastery amulets, then grabbing them for life will pretty much be essential if you're not life. But then again, if you're not life, then you really should be training into, you should be grabbing every life spell anyways. There are some life spells that are pretty good, like Sprite's a decent low pip heal. Seder's alright, is pretty good as well. It's probably one of the best heals that you can learn in the game. But, yeah, you probably it's a good school to train into, but it's not the best. But it's pretty much not required any as much as it used to be. Really, you only need to use it if you're solo questing and you have a life mastery amulet. If you don't have either of those, or if you're not either solo questing or you don't have a life mastery amulet, it's probably best to not go into this school and save your training points to use on the next school. Yeah, I'm putting Tower Shield at tier 2. Now, some people will probably either A, put it at tier 1, saying, oh, you need to learn Tower Shield, or some people will put it as, like, you don't need to learn Tower Shield at all. I'm saying that, yeah, you can learn Tower Shield, but it's not essential. It's pretty much going to grab all of the death spells, grab the Elemental or Spirit Blade, then start learning Ice, in my opinion. And, yeah, it's alright, I guess. It's an okay spell, it's okay. It's pretty good as well, the Tower Shield, obviously. But it's not essential. And the reason why most people say don't bother going into Ice for Tower Shield is because of the set shields like Legend Shield or Glacier Shield or whatever the other schools have. The reason, these giving like a minus 70 is really good. The reason Tower Shield is so, is so polarizing is because it's a minus 50 to everything. It's just a minus 50 compared to the minus 70. But I think it's really useful, especially because A, it protects against balance damage as well as astral damage, which you won't have any spells to counter it, and shadow as well, to be fair. So basically, it counters some damage in some schools that have a lot of damage, and also, yeah, it's still a decent spell. 50, minus 50 is still pretty good at the end of the day, plus whatever resist you got. So it's still okay, but it's not as powerful or as required as most people make it out. So, which is why it's not a useless spell like some people make it out, but it's not as required as people make it out. It's nice to have, and again, some people who are going to be, supporting, so like balance or life, will find better use of it rather than someone who's going to be straight up hitting, like, for example, fire, for example. I mean, it is still useful to grab, so, which is why it's coming in at tier 2. And I think that's the end of the tier 2s, actually. Yeah, there's not really much else to say on tier 2. So, I'm going to go on to tier 3. Now, these are spells that they're nice to have, but for the most part, they're not essential. So, starting with the tier 3s, I don't think there's anything better than really just talking to this girl here with the tier 3 spells. And, yeah, I'm going to have to say, yeah, they're not really too good. They're the shield spells. You get a few of them. I think you can see here there's 5, which I haven't got because I've got the fire one. It's just an 80 shield for a specific school. Pretty good, and yeah, it's definitely the best. It's the best shield in the game. But here's the problem. Which is why I say it's only a tier 3. You get stuff like Glacier Shield, Volcanic Shield. Obviously, if you went down life, you'd have already got Volcanic Shield, which means you wouldn't have to get Fire and Storm Shield because you've already got a minus 70. If you went down life, you've got Legend Shield, so that means you don't need to go down Death and Myth. Death, obviously, you're going to go down Dream Shield anyways. You're going to hit Dream Shield, so that means life and again Myth. So, the problem is that, yeah, you don't need to grab these. They're nice to get, but they're not essential. So, in Unicorn Way, you actually have this trainer here, Diego, and he mostly teaches you about PvP and all that kind of crap, but he also can train you. Oh, you can actually get Conviction. It used to be that you needed to get like a specific PvP rank to get Conviction, but I guess you can get it now. Interesting. I'm not going to get it, but those are definitely... He sells you Stun Block and Conviction. He used to sell Cloak as well, but Cloak was so goddamn useless that it literally was a meme. Like, no one used it as, like, ironically used Cloak. Oh, fuck, he's not even let me speak to him. But yeah, Conviction, it's a good... You can see here, it gives a stun resist for 90%, and then 20% block. Pretty good, and because it's an aura spell, so you have a few turns of it. So it's pretty good, but it's not worth it, in my opinion, as like a must grab. The block doesn't really come into effect around like level 50 anyways, and even then, like, blocks so easy to get that it's not even worth it. Stun shields as well, again, they only really are useful against myth enemies, and even then, stun's not really the biggest catastrophe in this game. And I think the only reason I would say this is a fantastic spell to grab is if you're myth. Grabbing stun block lets you lets you access Scion easier, because you can spam stun blocks on yourself to get the double damage bonus for Scion. So it's useful for stun blocks are useful for Scions, and that's about it for Myth Scion. So for Myth, I could probably see this going up to tier 2, but for everyone else, it's a tier 1. It's a tier 3. I meant not tier 1, a tier 3. Yeah. Diego, not too bad, but, you know, they're not bad spells, but there's more useful spells you can grab. So the final optional one, well, the final tier 3, in my opinion, is down here in Colossus Boulevard. It's all the way down here, into this house here, and there's a witch inside who sells us some interesting spells, to say the least. So Farsi will sell us dispels, but she also sells a balance spell called Reshuffle, and I'm going to be talking about both these spells here, both Reshuffle and the dispels. If you don't know, dispel is essentially a 2-pip spell that you can cast on an enemy, and it basically makes it so that the next time they use a specific spell, that spell will, so let's say they use a fire spell, they have a fire spell on it, that spell will get dispelled, and they lose whatever. It counts as a cast somehow, but they will lose they lose the pips, they lose everything like that. However, it will basically, they won't cast it. It's a very useful spell. I've got the life version of it here in Tangle, because life dispels are kind of useful, like especially if you're against certain bosses. It's also quite useful against. Fire dispels are also kind of useful as well against the Jabberwocky, because this completely counters the Jabberwocky cheat. Like, some of them are useful for countering certain cheats, so, but again, you really don't need to use them until the mid to late game, so, but by that point, you're going to be using your spell points for a lot more other spells, so, stuff like, Melt, Evaporate, Unbalance, they're alright to grab. As for the final spell you get is Reshuffle. Now, Reshuffle basically shuffles your deck back. So, basically, when you use a spell or you discard it, that's gone forever for the fight. If you use Reshuffle, however, it will reshuffle the spells. It reshuffles your deck, so you basically get the spells back again. Very useful for fights like, for instance, the Stained Duelist, the Desired Duelist is pretty good. A good one. I've used it on the original Medulla. I used it on that fight because, well, Medulla is a dick. Some fights where the enemies come back, like Malastair could be used, like Malastair and Dartmoor could be useful on it. But yeah, basically for longer fights, it can save your life. It's better in the early and mid game, but for the later game, you probably, again, it's useful to have, but not required to have. I think if you're soloing Jade only as a life, yeah, you're probably going to have to use the reshuffle, but yeah. Other than that, that's really it for tier 3s, and that's it for Arc 1, or early game. So I'm going to go on to the start with the mid game now. The mid game spells that you should learn, and how to unlock them. So moving on to Celestia. For the first tier 1 in the early game, there's basically these 2 trainers here. You can see here there's 3 trainers down here. Now, in order to access them, I think you have to speak to this woman here. And basically, the ones you want to talk to are the Sun and the Star one. Don't worry about Moon. Moon is rubbish, but I've already got them. But the Sun one will give you the spell. Hold on, where is it? Strong and Giant. These are really crucial spells, and honestly, yeah. 100 damage to the next spell, to a damage spell, is pretty good. That gives, it turns Meteor Strike from doing 300 to 400 damage. Giant's 125. Very useful in the early game, or the mid game, really. And the star one has a spell called Fortify, which some people debate this. I think it's one of the most useful spells to grab in the early game because, I mean, a minus 15% natural incoming to all incoming is really useful. I mean, it turns this to 60% resistance. Very, very, very useful. We're not leaving Celestia just yet, as, well, there's another trainer that we have to speak to, this Sun School here, which gives access to some more spells, but keenly, mostly, I mean, it gives access to Gargantuan and Monstrous. Monstrous, I think, if most people will know what this does, 175, most people use Monstrous TCs to buff up their damage. I personally haven't been doing this on my Death at the moment, because I've been using Colosso Frog, which can't be buffed. And that's the thing as well. These spells here, the blue spells, which are items decks, they can't be buffed by sun spells, which is a shame. Gargantuan, though, you'll get this very early, obviously, in Celestia, and you're going to be using this until the next spell, Colossal. But it's still a very good spell. You can see here, 225 damage extra. That is a lot more damage, but it's a very good spell, and pretty much grab these two spells as soon as you have the chance. Easy tier 1 spells. So a little bit of change of scenery here. We have Zafaria and its Sun School trend. Now you have to do 2 side quests in order to get this spell. Jesus Christ, that's loud. But yeah, you got to do 2 quests to get to this trainer. I think you have to do one which activates the Star School, and then you have to do this one to activate the Sun School trainer. I'll talk about the Star School one a little bit because that's got a interesting spell for later. But for this spell, you want to get Colossal. You'll get Colossal. Our Colossal is one of the most important spells in the game. This one, you will use this spell until Polaris, okay? You will use it until around Polaris. And that's how much, that's like 4 or 5 worlds away. You're basically going to be using this spell for the majority of the mid game. So yeah, it's an easy tier 1 spell. 50 more damage than Gargantuan. 275 damage. That can be a big difference with obviously the stats increases from damages. But that is a very, very, very easy, big. It's a big change basically. It's a big buff. 50 damage, it might not seem like much, but that actually can be a big help. The only problem is, it's in Drum Jungle, which is the second to last area of Zafaria. Like, after this, you've got, you don't really have much after Drum Jungle, do you? Yeah, you have the Graveyard, and then you have Mirror Lake, and then you're done. But yeah, other than that, it's pretty good, actually. It's a really good spell to grab, and yeah, easy tier 1 spell. So the final tier 1 for the mid game is actually a 2-for-1 here. We've got these two, which is the Sun and Star School trainers in Azteca. To get these, you have to do 2 quests. You have to do the quests in Zafaria first. Then around I think it's quite early in Celestia as well. Like, it's really early in Celestia. You get the Star School quest here, which gives you access to these auras. Now, these ones, you can see, they give 20% damage, 25% damage for, as well as either accuracy or power pip chance, depending on the school. Like, for example, it gives accuracy for elemental schools, and it gives power pip chance for spirit schools. As well as this, it also gives a plus 10 increase to incoming damage from the opposing school. So for fire, it gives increased damage to ice, obviously, stuff like that. It's a very good spell to grab, in my opinion, and yeah, I would honestly, yeah, it's a good spell to grab. Now, the life actually is unique, as they have, well, life and balance have 2 versions of this spell. Life balance pretty much has chastisement, which means that you can do 5% for either fire, ice, or storm, or death, life, and myth. Honestly, I don't know. If you should only really grab one, in my opinion. And life obviously has circle of life for healing, which circle of life is pretty good. So I would recommend grabbing this if you're life. But this is the main one, the Sun School. Oh my god, the Sun School. Now, Primordial's the only one I haven't trained, but I would still say this is a tier 1 spell, especially for life. It's tier 2, maybe even tier 3. It's not even useful for anything else, but for life, it's easier tier 1. The main one you want to get this for is Potent Trap and Sharpened Blade. Potent Trap puts 10% to the next trap, and Sharpened Blade gives 10% to a blade. Oh my god, these are beyond useful. Like, I always spam out, you know, these. I use these spells all the time, you know, so you can get 45 blades, maybe with a 40 blade, hit it with a dragon, boom, you're dead. Every enemy dies. These are beyond useful for any class. It doesn't matter what playstyle you're using. It doesn't matter what you're using. You can be an ice. They're gonna be eternally useful because you can use elemental blade. You can be balance, again, very useful because of balance blade and obviously elemental spirit blade. You can be hitting yourself, very useful because it gives you the 45 blades. And the same with Potent Trap, incredibly useful for feint stacking, because the thing is, well, they stack, so you can put a 35 and a 45 and they'll stack together. You can do a 35, 45, 35, 45 item blade, like what I've got here with my 40 blades, and they'll stack. Feint as well. You can put a 70 and an 80% feint on top of each other. They are ungodly powerful, and it's why it's coming in easily as a tier 1. Now let's talk about tier 2s. So yeah, if you don't know what this is actually the Stellarium, which is the second. I think it's the first or second dungeon. It's one of the dungeons in Celestia. But yeah, I've gone all the way back to Celestia, and there's a couple spells you can grab here, which I would recommend. There's really only 2 spells here to grab. Which is it's Infal and Vengeance. I think these are tier 2 because Infal's the tier 2, whereas Vengeance is a tier 3 in my opinion. Infal's really good for Pierce, and it's more useful against bosses which have like a small amount of resist for your school. See, and it's pretty useful if you can't actually, you know, if you have low accuracy, you can just pop an Infal. But I think Fortify is a much better aura, and Furnace as well for fire is a much better one. So yeah, honestly, yeah, these two just pretty much are much better options, which is why it's a tier 2. Tier 3 for Vengeance though, because Vengeance kind of sucks. It's alright for extra crit, but yeah, I would just pretty much say Infal. Always get Infal over Vengeance. Infal is definitely a tier 2. And now we're back to Zafaria, and this is the final tier 3. And yep, it allows things again. It's Mend and also Berserk. So Mend is pretty much the, if you remember the spell Circle of Life, it's a weaker version of that. The reason I say it's a tier 3 because, well, it's a decent heal, but you could probably, and, you know, it's decent for what it is. But, yeah, Berserk though, on the other hand, this is 100% a spell that you're never going to use, but it unlocks something a lot better later, which I'll talk about when I get to that trainer. Anyways, there really isn't much else to say other than about mid-game, so let's go to late game. So, for the easiest tier 1 for the final, you know, the end of the game, you know, which I say late game, the easiest tier 1 is definitely the Shadow spell, in particular the Shadow Strike spell, which some schools will get it by default. Fire gets it by default. Some schools do not get this by default. So, and if you don't get it by default, get it. It is by far one of the most, it is such a really powerful spell. I mean, plus 50% pierce, plus 10% damage for a debuff of negative 25 health. And it lasts for about 3 turns, and then eventually you will get hit by some backlash, depending on if you've pissed it off or not. So if you don't piss it off by blading and attacking, so it's really useful. And if you end the fight before the backlash hits, you won't get backlash damage, which is very nice. Yeah, it's a very good spell. It does a lot. It's really useful for, well, hitting, really. You know, the Pierce is very useful against bosses that have a lot of just universal resist. And, you know, hitting in general, you know, it's a really good spell. The only problem is it's a shad spell. But, you know, I don't know why I don't carry these around as often, especially with Novas pretty much shield spamming. And, yeah, it's really useful on Novas if you don't have enough Pierce to get through the shield spamming twats with infinite resist. But, yeah, it's pretty nice. It's a nice spell, and I would recommend it, especially in the mid to late game. So coming in, we have a big collection of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, ironically. Like, Kaiban pretty much gives every astral spell, but you need to learn everything beforehand. So, if you haven't done the quests for stuff like, you know, these quests, you won't be able to learn them. But yeah, he basically can teach you every astral spell. And honestly, yeah, he does teach you, however, a spell that you need to get, 2 spells that you need to get at tier 1, a few spells at tier 2, and a few spells at tier 3. So, yeah. For the tier 3 spells, I'll go back. I'll work my way backwards. For tier 3, you could grab Renewal, which is basically Mend, but it requires you to get Mend, but yeah. Mend, obviously, is, yeah, it's kind of okay. It's basically just, Circle of Life only without the debuff and without the power pip chance, so it's alright, I guess. Renewal's alright. Flawless you can get if you're still having accuracy problems in the late game, but again, tier 3. The same as, I think I put the other one at tier 2, but yeah. You can also get any other spell you want from here, so yeah. As for what else he offers, at tier 2, he also offers Aegis and Indemnity. I only put these at tier 2 because they're alright. They're really only useful if you're against a boss that either loves to get rid of blades or has a cheat that requires Aegis or Indemnity. I think, you know, Omen has that, like the Omen Skeleton Key boss has that, so very useful to use Aegis or Indemnity. As for the other ones, he gives you 3 other spells that are pretty much essential. First one is Brace. Brace is basically an upgrade to Fortify, and yeah, it's plus 20. Frenzy is the upgrade to Berserk, which again, it's basically Berserk but flipped. So instead of doing 30 damage but you get 40 incoming, you instead do 40 damage for 30 incoming. Very useful. I'd recommend both of them. And finally, we have Epic. Epic is the best damage enchant in the game. 300 over Castle's 175. Again, you might be thinking, oh, that's only 25 damage. It will matter a bit more in the long term, because I've had enemies that have survived by 1 HP. So if I was using Epic over Colossal, yeah, he would have died. Other than that, not really much else to say about Kaiban. He's good. He's had some good spells, so yeah. Anyways, let's continue with tier 3, because there's not really any tier 2s that you can't get other than from Kaiban. The next tier 3 I'm going to go is from Velma von Verkman, which is this spell here. Now, she does give you a few other spells, like she gives you some shadow damage spells, which they're alright, I guess. They're okay. I wouldn't recommend using them, though. It's Donate Shadow, I think, is the main one. What this does is you can give 2 Shadow Pips to an ally. A Shadow Pip to an ally for 2 Shadow Pips. It's not the best. And especially if you're hitting where you need to be using shads. You know, if you're, let's say you're fire and you want to be, you're hitting. You're going to be using the shads for spells like Small Machine. You're going to be using the spells, for spells like Raging Ball. That's about it, really, that fire has. Or you're going to be using it for Shrike. So I wouldn't recommend using Donate Shadow for those. As for the other for other schools who aren't particularly going to be using shadow spells as much, it's good. Yeah, so which is why it's coming in at tier 3, because for some schools it's okay. For fire, not so much. So now for the final tier 3, and this one's actually going to be a weird contradiction to what I've already said, and that is going down one of the other schools. Now, the reason I'm saying this is a tier 3, and the reason why I am saying this is because I think this is tier 3 out late game, because you don't need to do this, obviously, but here's why. In the late game, you start getting gear that gives split, basically. You can see here, not my hat, bad example, very bad examples. I can't really find them actually, but stuff like the Aeon Sword, you can see here, is starting to give split damage. It's basically splitting its damage. You can see here between fire and myth. The Fame here also gives fire and myth. The amulet doesn't give anything because the amulet is shit, but I think the ring as well, fire and myth. So, you can see here, without even really trying, I'm getting 60 myth damage. Without really, investing in any myth gear, which is around mid-game stats for myth. If I was to really invest in pins on my hat, you can see here I've got a myth crit and pierce hat. I've also got, myth accuracy on my boots. So if I was going onto my pins, you can see here I could possibly start investing into, if I actually did do this, I could start investing on, accuracy and stuff like that. And that means I could probably go down the myth tree, the myth school tree, which I haven't got a single myth spell on here. You can see it's the only school I don't have a spell on, I think, other than Storm. Yeah, Myth and Storm are the only two I don't have spells on. But if I wanted to, I could go down this myth spells, start grabbing stuff like Earthquake or Humongo Frog or, Minotaur. Some spells, I won't be able to get. Like, I think there's a few spells that require, like, for example, Golem Taunt. I'm not going to be able to get because I can't get Golem. I can't get the Golem. And I think there's another one which you can't get. Where is it? There's one which you can't get because you need, where is it? I think there's another one you can't get. I know for life there's one you can't get because you need to regenerate, but yeah. Basically, yeah, you could go down I could go down myth and start working down myth. And obviously, I'm not saying it's recommended, but the pin system does allow for this. So, yeah, I would, and because of how fire works, with it getting, requiring myth pips for its end game spell, Glimpse of Infinity at the moment, which is shit, by the way. Seriously, don't get that spell. It's, yeah, you're going to be using, myth pips quite a bit if you're using that spell, so you might as well go down myth. I know, some school, I think each school has, like, a alternate, so, like, oh, fuck, I just went into the tower by accident, even though I pulled out, fuck's sake. But, yeah, some, I think it's, like, life has Storm, myth has fire, stuff like that. Each school has an alternative. So for balance, it's kind of a little different because balance doesn't have one. I think it has two, which can be a bit weird. But for death, for example, you might go down the ice school, and start using some ice spells. For Storm, you might go down the life schools, not only life spells. It's stuff like that. Because their gear gives, because the gear gives extra damage for certain schools, which is pretty good. So, yeah. That's my pick for training points for the tier 3 training points. But there's also one thing. Let's say you're like, oh, I've made mistakes. I've cocked up big time. How do I get rid of training points? All you got to do is talk to this dude right here. He will refund you training points. You can see here. It costs some crowns. I'm not doing it anyway because I've got enough. But yeah, because I don't really need to. But yeah. Other than that, that's about it really. Yeah. There's not really much else to say about training points. That's really my recommendation. Obviously, of course, you could do other stuff like, for example, if you have balance, and not balance, if you have like, some schools you might grab like infection, for example, which I've grabbed because some some people I know have, you know, if you have gambits on that require, you know, negative charms, you might use infection because, well, enemies aren't going to heal often, are they? Whereas with weakness, again, that's a decent one to grab as well if you want to, you know, just annoy enemies. You know, shift spells here, which are the moon spells, they're kind of interesting. You can grab them if you wanted to, but yeah. Other than those, you know, there's not really much else to grab. You know, the shift spells are kind of cool to... they're just joke spells to grab, but yeah. Other than that, not really else to say about training points, other than it's really your choice again. These are just my recommendations for how to do it. You might completely disagree with me. You might go, oh, you know, life's very important to me because I need to heal, so I'm going to go down life school straight away, even though I wouldn't recommend it, because really the only thing I would recommend is going down death straight away and then grabbing the astral spells as well as soon as you can, the astral sun spells as soon as you can. But other than that, not really much else to say. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, this small guide on training points. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video.